Many thanks, David, and many thanks for those who participate both in person here and remotely in this seminar. I have entitled or subtitled it as saying it's a brainstorming, because it's quite clear that in the current situation, which brings news every day, it is very difficult to say anything definite about what will be the fallout of this. I've called it here crisis or war. Let me just perhaps add one personal note. I'm sitting here in the Villa Schifanoia in the Robert Schuman Center in Fiesole, in a very serene surrounding. And I cannot help keep thinking about how the situation might look like in Ukrainian cities, which are under bombardment. They are facing the real war while we are talking only about it. If it were something abstract, but it is, I think, very real. Many people have been killed, lives upended. And I think we should keep that in mind. It's a very serious issue. Now, our task, or my task today, is to present some of my thoughts on how this situation right now will impact the European economy. And I will mainly concentrate on the EU, much less on the rest of the world, and very little about Ukraine itself. And as this is already a very broad topic, let me try to, okay, let me see what's happening here. Okay, how do I advance it? With this one here?
You can use the arrows.
That's what I did. This what I did. Sorry, we have a little technical problem here. It will be solved soon.
You need to arrow here. Do you see? Just go here.
Where is it?
You just click on the file and the show.
Okay, good. So I wanted to make a few points, but many of them are related actually to energy, both in the form of current high prices, and secondly, in the question of what Europe can do to limit its dependency on Russian gas, essentially. But let me perhaps start with something which I regard as secondary, at least in the greater scheme of things, and that is the direct impact of the situation on demand, right? In a usual macroeconomic approach. And there I would argue that we have two direct effects on demand, which are of opposite sign, but of similar magnitude. There is, of course, first of all, the loss of exports, European exports to Russia, about which are running or were running about 80-90 billion per year. And if they all were lost, it would be 1.5%. It would be a bit over, a bit close to 1% of GDP. Even if it's 2/3 of it, it would be about 0.5% of EU GDP. So significant, but not overwhelming. Against that, you have to set the positive impact of the increase in military expenditure, which is in the pipeline, which is partially already happening because many goods and services are already being bought and sent as military support to Ukraine itself. Plus there's expenditure for the refugees. This is actually an item of expenditure which could become quite important. If you look at the empirical literature, the typical cost of a single refugee is around, per annum is around between 10 and 15,000 euro, at least in the richer EU countries. If you were to multiply that by 5 million, you quickly get to substantial numbers. Right? We are not there yet, but I just wanted to share with you that that is something which might be coming. In a sense, it's a positive demand effect if it is financed out of deficits, which I presume it will be initially, but that is something to keep in mind. But overall, I would say if you are worrying about the European economy, the direct demand effects are, for me, secondary. The real impact of the war is very often viewed through the lens of energy. And there's a common assumption that the high prices we are seeing now are a direct consequence of the war. And I think there are some reasons to doubt that. And that if one looks closer, then maybe the problem is a little bit elsewhere. And that itself is not just a question of what are the causes, but it also has, of course, implications of the proper government response. And as I say here, if one looks closer at the price action, one sees that the impact of the war maybe has been transitory. And the question is what actually the war will have on the supply-demand balance. Now, first of all, here I show you something which has been commented upon a lot, namely the spot prices for gas, which have really exploded. You see here that they have gone by a multiple. I think you can see it properly over there, right? By a multiple of the previous level. And I will show the price action on other commodities as well, where it's much higher. But really here, if you're talking about 4 times, 5 times, 6 times higher. But the important point is that we saw a spike when the war broke out, but we have already had similar levels of gas prices since October of last year, which is a first indication that maybe we already had accumulated a supply-demand imbalance before the war really started. And that, of course, has implications on how we view the present situation. If you look at the chart for crude oil, you see here the increase in percentage terms is much, much smaller, around 50–60%, so going from $60 per barrel to 100. But very often people measure the increase with respect to the trough, which you see the little thing going down in 2020. That was, of course, exceptional, but compared to the previous 5-year period, I think the increase in the oil price is much, much smaller in percentage terms, but because oil is so much more important, actually the impact on the European economy might be stronger. Now, one step back to the gas prices. Here, I show you 2 gas prices. The mauve or lila line, which spikes up at the right-hand side, that is the spot price, which you always see in the newspapers, what's called TTF in Rotterdam. What you see below all these colored lines, which remain much lower, that is the price, or rather the unit cost, which you actually get when you take the balance, the trade statistics, and divide the amount actually paid by importers with the volume they receive. And you see that those have also increased. They have roughly doubled, I would say, with respect to the last years. They have increased by more than double if you look just at last year, right? But again, the last 2 years were exceptional, I think. We had very low spot prices. But with respect to the past average, they have roughly doubled. And I mean that the prices for Germany, Italy, but also Japan. You see the line for China, which is always a little bit higher than our European prices. But you see that there's a close correspondence between these prices actually paid and the spot prices until about the middle of last year. Right? So right now, basically, the spot price has quadrupled, whereas the prices actually paid have more or less doubled, quote unquote, only. And I think that has a big impact on how you think you should compensate consumers, whether you have price caps.
Why is that? Is that because the influence of forward prices, forward contracts, or what is the reason for that?
I must admit, I don't know really, because these are for very almost immediate delivery, right? There are also prices which are quoted, at least. I don't know whether many quantities are being sold for delivery 2 years down the road forward, and they are much, much lower, right? But maybe somebody in the audience can enlighten us.
Contracts that were done 2 years ago, would that explain the difference between spot and actual prices now? So if it contracted for delivery today, 2 years ago?
A large part of the actual volume still being delivered has semi-indexed prices. A long time ago, the price of gas was actually indexed to the price of oil, 1-to-1, because the argument was in electricity production generation, you can substitute more or less 1-for-1 gas for oil, and therefore the price ratio should remain more or less constant. That in European Commission thought that was not a good practice. There should be more more market influence on the prices, and that's why people have moved away from this, but not totally. The existing contracts are a mixture of some indexation, some reference to stock price, to spot prices, but it's not exactly the same, right? But as I just wanted to warn you that the prices you actually see are not, or that you read about, are not the ones which are actually being paid by our importers. And I would argue, as you see here, that perhaps you can see the spot price as the marginal cost if you need small additional quantities, whereas the actual price represents more the average cost, right? Why the two have stayed together for a very long time and then suddenly diverge, I don't know, but that is something we need to consider. What I also wanted to say, what you see a little bit in this previous chart is that Europe and Asia have been integrated over most of this time, with most of this time Asian prices somewhat higher than European prices. And the reason is very simple. Asia gets almost all of its gas via LNG. And Europe is the balancing market because we in Europe have both pipelines arriving from one way, from the east, and then also some LNG from overseas. And if you send a tanker out of Australia, whether the tanker goes to Japan or Europe, right, the cost of delivery is more or less the same, right? Once the stuff has been liquefied and put on the tanker. So that's why, and that is, I think, very important to keep in mind. It means that when we talk about the gas market, we have Europe and Asia coupled together and the same price. I will talk about that later. If the price in Europe goes up, the Asians suffer as well. The United States are not integrated right now for the simple reason that they have surplus gas and it cannot be exported because they don't have enough liquefying facilities. That will change in a couple of years or 5 years down the road. We just don't know. But for the time being, so we have Asia, Europe, and then the US and Happy Island with much lower prices. Now, the purpose of talking about these costs was to ask ourselves, how large is the hit in terms of trade loss for the EU, right? The loss of purchasing power. And here I just made a very simple exercise. I just looked at how much Europe has spent in the past on gas, which was actually very moderate, about 60 billion per year. You see it here, it has fluctuated somewhat with the volume actually increasing. But what happens now to the value if we have present gas prices? Right? And the question is which prices? If it were the spot price would be 4 times higher. So out of 60, you have 240, 180 billion more. If it were quote unquote only the average price, which we see today, it would be quote unquote only 2 times, and there would be an additional loss of 60 billion. So in terms of trade loss from gas, between 60 and 180 billion euros per annum, which is significant. I mean, the upper limit is 1% of GDP. In terms of oil, as I said, the terms of trade loss is in proportional terms much more moderate, but the total imported in value was also much higher, fluctuating a lot. If you take the last years, you see it was around, let's say, 180 billion, except for 2020, which was, of course, exceptional. And that could increase by about actually 150 billion more or less. If I take the two numbers together, we arrive at around something that could be perhaps 3% of European GDP as the pure terms of trade loss of purchasing power for our consumers, and therefore, of course, need for wage adjustment and loss in demand and so on, right? So that is, I think, serious. It is more or less similar to the 1973-79 shock, if it persists, of course, right? Then it was persisting, actually kept on increasing for a while. But the question here is for the gas, especially, will it persist? Now, one assertion I always see, often hear is that countries which have a very large share of Russian supply in their gas consumption are particularly exposed to the present situation. But I would argue that this reasoning is wrong, because as long as we have a common gas market with the same price, more or less, give or take a little bit of transport costs, then the increase in price hits everybody, whether you import Norwegian gas, because the Norwegians don't make us a discount, right? They will also increase their price. Algeria also, so other suppliers will also increase LNG supplies. And therefore, what matters really is for most countries, what is the amount of gas you import relative to your GDP, or even better, how much is the energy you import relative to your GDP. And here I thought, if one does this exercise, if one just looks at the ratio of how many terajoules a country imports relative to its GDP, one finds, for me at least, some surprising results. You see the highest value here for Poland. That is not a surprise, right? Relatively cold climate, heavy industry, and so on. But more surprisingly for me is that Spain, for example, is also one country which is relatively strongly energy dependent. And that explains, I think, some of the political noise one has seen coming out of Spain regarding the need to reduce prices for consumers. Germany, which is also often thought to be hardest hit because it depends a lot on Russian, or it gets most of its gas from Russia, actually has a energy intensity or import intensity, which is lower than that of the EU average, right? Whereas Italy is somewhat above, right? So, but as I said, you should not accept these statements that Italy and Germany are hit particularly hard because they import a lot of Russian gas. Now, why do we have these increases in the price level? And if you look at the literature, the two or the main alternative explanation is basically that we have had a low investment in hydrocarbon exploration for a couple of years, and that we are apparently in a sort of hog cycle where we invest too little, have high prices, more investment, and I think you all know that from the standard literature. And if you look at the data on upstream investment, then you see that it's actually impressive by how much investment has fallen, especially by the quote-unquote Western major oil companies, where it has actually halved. The question is whether it has something to do with ESG investment also. Until this crisis, we thought, okay, now let's forbid investment in coal and other dirty energies. Whereas investment by, how should I say, the non-Western producers, the non-perhaps democratic producers, has stayed constant. Which means that probably in the future we will increasingly face the conundrum that the energy which is still being produced, I mean gas and oil, will come from countries or companies located in countries which do not exactly share our values, and which were also perhaps in this Ukraine conflict not always exactly on our side. So that is, I think, a more long-term problem which you see coming up there. Now, that was the impact on the European economy, which I think is important, but probably not all due to the war, but more to the lack of investment, which has some implications also how you should react as a policy. If it is a war-induced scarcity, then of course you can argue that consumers need to be compensated, maybe a price cap would be appropriate. Whereas if it's something more structural, then it is very important actually to keep prices high so that consumption takes into account the real market price and cost of energy. But let me come now to this quest, which is intertwined a little bit with this, which is how to reduce Europeans' energy dependency, and of course, in particular, the dependency on Russia, right? Now, there are two planks to that argument. One is, if you want, the geopolitical one, which we see right now, right? You want to be protected against short-term supply disruptions. That is an argument which already existed beforehand, but what of course was made much more important or illustrated important right now. And then the new argument is a moral argument that we don't want to finance the Russian war effort. And of course, both arguments play out very differently for oil, coal, and easily transportable energy sources than for gas. But I think one has to keep in mind the following. If you want to protect against short-term supply disruptions for coal and gas, for coal and oil, that's easy. We just switch suppliers, right? Perhaps, but that actually means that only there's a more roundabout way of the same oil and gas, which oil and coal, which Russia exports, going to somewhere else, and we import the quantities which have been liberated. If you look at the more moral argument that we don't want to finance the Russian war effort, actually doesn't solve the problem, right? If Russia gets more or less the same revenue just by selling to somebody else, and we buy it from somewhere else, we elude ourselves that we don't contribute any more to the Russian war effort, but in reality, it is just a window dressing. Yeah.
I think we also need to consider the fact that Russia, as well as China, is full of rare earths, and right now it's selling platinum, cobalt, and at not at higher prices because it has a kind of monopoly power. So the war is financed also through that.
Yeah. So, now that's what I mentioned here, the perverse effect in the short run, that if the elasticity of demand is small, right, then even if you take a little bit of the quantities from the market, the price increases more than proportionally, right? But I think this is what we see right now in the metals. We see it right now with gas. Not so sure whether we see it also for oil. But we have to think also about the present value of their earnings, right? We see now the flow increases, but when the supply response comes on stream, I think we cannot be so sure about the present value of future Russian export earnings. And since Russia will probably be able to sell its stuff only at a discount, actually, I would argue that in present value terms, probably they are losing. But you don't see it immediately now. Now, for gas, of course, we have the concrete problem, how to get alternative supplies, right? Or how to satisfy our demand. And here we have estimates from the International Energy Agency and from the Commission, and they all say the same thing. Basically, we have to rely on more LNG, right? Because the savings within Europe are just not large enough that one could imagine. But I think we have to keep in mind two distinctive issues. One is to reduce overall gas consumption. And the other one is to switch away for the remaining gas consumption from Russian gas. The first one requires high gas prices. The second one requires that Russian gas be more expensive than non-Russian gas. And I think these two are important to keep distinct. And I would argue that we need a price signal for both. Now, we all know that Russia provides around 30% of the European gas market, which is around 550 billion cubic meters. But as I have argued earlier, the European market and the Asian market are linked. And therefore, what we're talking about is really a total market of around 1,300 BCM. And if you want to make up for the loss of Russian gas, which is no longer delivered to Europe, and cannot be transported by Russia to somebody else, right? Because they don't have the LNG facilities and pipelines. Then we need about a reduction in gas consumption in the combined European-Asian market of around 1,300 BCM, of around 150, 60 BCM. That's the amount of exports of Russia to the EU. And that would mean around 15% reduction in gas consumption in both markets. And the question is, can you achieve that? And my point would simply be, if it is true that prices have roughly doubled, and if I look at the historical price elasticities of gas demand, which are around 0.2, that should be more than feasible. Actually, 0.2 times 2 would be 0.4, so a 40% reduction. In the short run, maybe the elasticity is somewhat lower, but I think this is possible. But I come back only if, of course, the price is allowed to increase.
Quick clarification. Is there a significant difference for the elasticity of large industrial producers and households, and that maybe makes the considerations more complicated?
Yes, there's a very high inter-fuel elasticity for power generation. Oil or gas, you can switch, and that's why in the past it was indexed. I have actually seen very recently some study from a Flemish gas agency operator, and they have noted that already now for the months of January and February, the demand even by households was down between 5 and 16%, and they have probably taken into account the weather and economic activity and so on, so they have factored in those measures. So yes, there's a difference, but even for households, the elasticity is, I say, positive, right, or negative. I mean, it's significant, right? Of course, all on the assumption that you don't have price caps. So, and that brings, so the first point is that in the combined Euro-Asian market, it should be possible to generate enough savings at present gas prices, not even higher prices, to make room for whatever, to substitute for the missing Russian gas. But the question is, of course, how do you get people to switch away from Russian gas? And there, my simple proposal is that we need a price mechanism. Mainly, we need an import tariff on Russian gas, which, of course, I look at Bernard here, is not compatible with WTO. But as we discussed, I think that can be justifies here under the Article 21. This is a question of national security for us. And I want to see Russia to go to the WTO appellate body to take us to court, so to speak.
Isn't Russia suspended from the WTO anyway, or there was something, no? No, stop. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nasty.
I think you would have had unanimity, right? And that, including Russia. Yeah. So, okay, formally the rules still apply, but de facto, I think we can, in this part, we can ignore them. So, and then we come actually in the area of very standard trade policy analysis. I have done a little model where I have gone through all the equations, and I don't want to bore you with that. I just wanted to present you the economic intuition, which has, I think, an important aspect to it. Because we are here not talking about a small country facing a completely elastic supply curve, but we are talking here about a country which faces a foreign monopolist or somebody who has some monopoly power, meaning somebody for whom there's a difference between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve, right? Perhaps as a background, I took this given, Gazprom has the monopoly of exports of gas from Russia. And by the way, Gazprom is, of course, dominated by the Russian government. So all the gas deliveries and contracts in Europe were basically done by a monopolist on one side and very small buyers on our side. Now, what does a monopolist do? He equates marginal cost to marginal revenue, not the price. And that's what you see here at this intersection here. The horizontal lower line is the marginal cost C, MC. And at the intersection between that marginal cost and marginal revenue, you have the quantity which Gazprom would be willing to deliver under free trade, right? And the price would be higher, would be up here at P free trade. So that's the equilibrium that we have had so far, where basically Gazprom was earning a monopoly rent, which is equal to that blue area there. Now, what happens if we Europe impose a small tariff? Then the cost for Gazprom goes up, price plus tariff. And the new intersection with the marginal cost curve is here. The result is higher price, right? You already see that the increase in the price is less than the increase in the tariff. That's a standard argument. It's actually with linear demand curves, it's 1/2, right? I'm saying that because that's important when politicians think about if we do a tariff on Russian gas, how much will the price increase in Europe? And the answer is by 1/2, right?
Sì, grazie.
And so that's one result. And then the question is, what is the welfare impact of this move? And here you get into the usual triangles and other stuff. You see that the consumer surplus is reduced by this triangle here and this A plus B rectangle. all standard stuff because you now have less consumption of the good in question. And the government gets the revenue, which is that part here, the amount which is still imported times the tariff, right? And the question is, which one is bigger? And for a small tariff, it is always bigger. So basically, when you are a country facing a foreign monopolist, it always pays to have some tariff, right? Because if the tariff were infinity or it goes so high as to make importing prohibitive, then that would not be beneficial. But a small tariff is beneficial for the home country when you face a foreign supplier. So that's basically the money which Europe has left on the table for Gazprom over the last, 20 years. The question is then, and there you need to handle the equations, how high is the optimum tariff? The tariff which maximizes our welfare. And in the little model, which I don't want to present you now, it's would take too long. What I find that the optimum tariff would be approximately 1/3 of the maximum price which our market could bear. Right, and if it's right now the maximum, right? So 1/3 approximately of the price and that would cut Gazprom's revenues by 1/2. Right, just if you calculate through the model. And then you can ask a different question, which comes back to the aim which I mentioned earlier. What if your aim of your policy is not just standard economic welfare as we know it, producer surplus, consumer surplus, but on top of it, you want to reduce the revenues for Gazprom. So I put in our utility function, so to speak, the reduction of the revenues for Gazprom. And if you can do that, you can calculate what would be the optimum, I call it the optimum sanction then, right? Because would not be optimum, the idea would be to sanction Russia. And if you work through the equations, then you find that the optimum sanction, or if you set the tariff rate so that you have the optimum sanction effect, then it would be about twice as high. So not 1/3, but 60%. Yeah.
How did you estimate the welfare effect of the utility received from the sanction, right? So how much am I willing to increase my price to satisfy the desire of the sanction?
1-to-1. So I'm willing to spend €1 so that Gazprom gets 1 less, right? I'm willing to accept a reduction in my welfare of €1 so that Gazprom gets 1 less. I could change that, right? It just makes the equations more. And then that would cut Gazprom's revenues to less than 1/4. So end of the story is that with the tariff, you can already achieve a lot. And you can think about it in 2 ways. The standard optimal tariff argument, where we can argue, okay, that's actually something which is fair game anyway. And then the second step would be, do we actually want to sanction Russia and actually have the intent of hurting it? And then we would go a bit higher. And that's the situation right now. And that is, I think, the live policy issue which is facing policymakers right now, which is what to do right now. Can we stop just imports? I think would be very difficult. And also, if you were just give a quantitative restraint, if you say from next month onwards, we want to import 1/2 of Russian gas. Okay, but who gets that 1/2? At what price? Right? So, some people have also suggested just to say, okay, Gazprom, we buy your gas only at your marginal cost. Take it or leave it. A, they might not take it. But B, if they did that, then, okay, we get this gas cheaply, and who resells it? At what price? Who gets that rent? I think this would be very, very difficult to do. And therefore, I think that the smart thing to do is to have a tariff on imports from Russia. My point was that if you look at the economic impact of the war, it probably we should look at energy prices, but that something which we haven't discussed a lot, but I think we should reflect on whether this is really all war related or whether a large part is not something which was already happening beforehand because of the lack of investment. And if that's the case, then we have to be ready for a longer period, and becomes even more important that we accept the higher oil or gas prices domestically so that consumption can adjust. My own proposal for a tariff was something which is, let's say, modest, but it would actually be in our interest. And therefore, I think we should have done it anyway a long time ago. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't get Putin out of Ukraine. But why not do something which is efficient, actually super efficient? It's the smartest sanction we can think about because it doesn't hurt us. And therefore, that's why I think it should be undertaken, if possible, in coalition with as many countries around the world that might be willing to participate.
Well, I thank you, Daniel. That was a marvelous presentation. Very good discussion. I'd like to thank the audience for being here and also for your interesting questions. And if people unmute, let's just have a little round of applause for everybody available before we go.
Bravo, Daniel.
All right. Thanks for coming. We'll hopefully see you again soon at the next Schuman Center seminar. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.